Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan looked for a big win in the recent parliamentary elections. Instead, he found himself somewhat emasculated. He wanted a supermajority win for the AKP parliamentary members so he could have more power and give more power to himself. That didn't happen. Take a look.
Turkish people have spoken in a recent national election to preserve democracy and modernization. Parliamentary elections, which were held on June 7th, came up with a result leaving Turkey's President Erdogan as the sole loser of this election. The Justice and Development Party, AKP, lost its majority in parliament for the first time since 2002. A coalition government will rule Turkey henceforward. Turkey's election results can be read as a fine-tuning of Turkish politics in this respect. The public observed a fast shift to authoritarianism and stopped it. In the build-up to the election, President Erdogan, although under an oath to be impartial, campaigned for AKP and had been seeking a two-thirds majority to turn Turkey into a presidential republic. But he miscalculated the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, HDP. The real winner of the elections is no doubt the pro-Kurdish party, HDP, which succeeded in crossing the threshold with an unexpected 13% performance. HDP co-chair Selahattin Demirtas even further increased his popularity in Turkish society with his sense of humor and smiles.
From tonight on, there is no more debate about presidential regime. There is no more question of dictatorship. It's not about a superior entity. It's not a conspiracy, and it's not an international conspiracy either. It's the choice and the right of the people that has spoken its soul and conscience.
After the parliament is sworn in later this month, Erdogan is expected to formally give the AK party the mandate to try to form a government. Eyeing a snap vote, none of Turkey's major parties have an interest in being seen to scupper a deal, meaning coalition negotiations could be drawn out potentially for months. The June 7 election is a clear indication that Turks will not give up their demand for a first-class democracy to be crowned with expanding freedoms. It is also encouraging that the next government will take stalled full membership negotiations with the EU as one of its priorities to give momentum to the talks.
We're back live on set now here at Fresh Outlook. I am joined by the Fresh Outlook think tank, Alain Sanders, political science professor at St. Peter's University, Yohuru Williams, vice president of academic affairs at Fairfield University, Dan Friedheim, former diplomat who has also worked in the U.S. State Department and World Bank with his new company as well now, which advises exporters on where to expand next. Dan, I will start with you. What's your take on the election results in Turkey?
Well, first, thanks for that great pitch.
I know.
More than I expected. And I wanted to say, just indulge personally and say, this kind of big, surprising, probably historic election, that's why I became a political scientist. This is what I live for. It was really resounding. You were talking about emasculation. I don't know about that, but it was clearly a defeat, and I would say at least a triple defeat. It was the Turkish population saying no, first of all, to one-man rule, increasingly one man dominating all political institutions. It was them also saying no to that one man, President Erdogan, starting to meddle and even start to hint at rolling back a few of the economic reforms that have made Turkey such an economic miracle this century. And finally, it was probably even a no to an expansionist, neo-Ottoman, maybe neo-imperialist foreign policy.
Alan, what's your take?
Well, I'm not so optimistic. That is to say, I agree that it was a no, and I agree that it was a clear message to President Erdogan, but we shouldn't forget that his party holds a commanding set of numbers in the parliament. So I think Turkey is probably in for a period of instability. It certainly slows Erdogan down. It tells him, no, one-man rule is certainly not what the people want, but in terms of his political position in the country, he still is the dominant politician. He's a wily politician, and I think he will use his commanding numbers in parliament to try to get his way as much as he can. And so lots of instability in store for Turkey.
Yohuru, your take on this?
Completely agree with both gentlemen. I mean, I think this is the dangerous moment, is right now. I agree that this was a wonderful moment. The Turkish people have spoken and affirmed their desire to maintain democracy in these parliamentary elections. That was wonderful. But the real danger comes in how Erdogan will respond to this and what we'll see in the next couple of weeks leading up to the next set of elections.
And that's been my thought as well. He has been dictatorial, at least over the last 2 years, cracking down on the press and so forth. Yeah. So he might not really accept these election results, and by not forming a coalition government, he might force new elections, correct?
Yes, and that would probably be the most destabilizing solution. It would really be no solution. Probably the results would come back the same.
What's the impact on the region? Because Turkey is geographically positioned to be the bridge between the East and the West. And now you have what was a growing democracy turning out to be an increasing dictatorial autocracy.
Well, it's going to depend on these very complicated but normal for parliamentary democracies, which is what Turkey is. Even though Erdogan is a president, he's not the lead politician, right? And with results like this...
Somebody needs to tell him that, though, right? No, because he's acting like he is.
Well, so the change is he no longer has an absolute majority, right? He can't actually stay in office without the cooperation of another party, whether it's tacit, not formal, or a more normal formal coalition, right? He has to deal with others, or he won't get anything through Parliament.
But it depends who he aligns himself with. If he aligns himself with the Nationalist Party, we could be into yet another period of autocracy and xenophobia and so forth. If he aligns himself with the other parties, which many people think is unlikely because their philosophy is quite opposed to his. So that's why it's not clear. I would say the party to watch and the group to watch is the Kurdish party, because the Kurds demonstrated that they are capable of forming alliances with other groups in Turkish society. And the Kurds basically are on the move throughout the region. They've been some of the prominent fighters and successful fighters against ISIL. Now they've had success in a democratic context. So I think we need to watch that, because that's an important development. The Kurds are on the move, and I don't mean that in an evil, conspiratorial way. They're moving forward.
Yohuru, that actually strikes me odd, because there had been so much demonization of the Kurds with the PKK and so forth, that people are actually fearful of the Kurds as a political force within Turkey. Can we talk about how that might have changed, the tenure might have changed over there, tenor might have changed over there a little bit? It
certainly changes the conversation in two respects. The first is that, and this was the complaint of journalists, is that a lot of that narrative was being shaped by Erdogan himself and by the administration. So that's problematic. Secondly, what's interesting about this is that Erdogan really is responsible for the triumph of this election. He actually put into place many of the reforms that have led to his stunning defeat in this context. So I think it's an opportunity for us to kind of take a step back, especially in the West, and take a look at what the Kurds' agenda is, what that political agenda is, aside from the rhetoric and the narrative and the propaganda. And it's also an opportunity for us to really see what is in the bag of tricks that Erdogan will now bring to bear, considering that these very reforms that he put in place ultimately circumvented his grasp at power. It noted in the piece, he wasn't supposed to be campaigning on behalf of either party. He did so because he was basically putting his chips, very Putin-like.
So we should say that's unconstitutional, right? That's not how a Turkish president is supposed to behave. They're supposed to be above partisan politics.
And largely ceremonial. Now, the country was on the precipice of becoming a member of the EU, or so it seemed. That's out the window now, I suppose?
That's true. I wanted to just finish on talking about the immediate region. We didn't really say what the immediate foreign policy impact is. There are two big Mideast issues still, right? One is Palestine-Israel peace possibilities, which Turkey's not really contributing much to. That's probably not going to change. The other big issue, of course, is the unintended rise of ISIS in the vacuum after the U.S. withdrew from Iraq. So dominating half of Syria right next to Turkey, right next to the Kurdish homeland, right? A few months ago, we were here talking about the outrageous surrender of the Kurdish town of Kobani right on the border. And the images, I'm sure everyone will remember, were Turkish troops within view, within earshot of ISIS taking over and slaughtering a lot of Kurds, right? They just stood back. So an interesting question is, depending on the complicated coalition arrangement, if the pro-Kurdish party, I call them now the leftist pro-Kurdish party, because they're not just Kurdish anymore, but they're clearly for doing more to defend Kurds. If they have more influence, then you could see a little bit more active Turkish regional policy right next door where it matters the most. However, that's probably the least likely coalition. It's much more likely that Erdogan will work with more traditional nationalists or secular Republicans who probably wouldn't back that. So maybe it won't lead to the USA, Turkey cooperating with the US and other allies in the region to stop ISIS. That would be a shame.
Right. Alan, one of the biggest transgressions, it seems, recently in Turkey has been the crackdown on the freedom of the press. And I think that's one of the issues that are going to stand in its way in its desire to be part of the EU, if that is even a desire any longer.
Well, of course, there are two issues here. One, will the EU survive? That's a question, and if it does it have a place for Turkey? Part of the EU's problem with Turkey is, even before Erdogan started having his autocratic views, was whether Turkey is culturally akin, culturally a comfortable country to go into the European community, so to speak.
If it's European enough.
Right, exactly. Is it European enough? And the crackdown on the media, of course, tells the European Union, wait a minute, we're not sure that Turkey understands some basic civil liberties concept that are central to the European conception of itself. So I think the crackdown on the media doesn't help. I also think the general autocratic tendencies that Mr. Erdogan has shown doesn't help. I, for one, have always been doubtful that Turkey would ever make it into the EU. There's lots of issues. Culturally, there's also the Cyprus issue, and certainly Erdogan's foreign policy has indicated that he has become more concerned with the Middle East rather than with Europe. And so Europe really has some tough questions to ask Erdogan. How he changes his views as a result of the election, nobody knows for sure. But I still think he has two problems. He's very much opposed to the Assad regime, and so he'll do whatever he thinks to bring that down. But he's also very much opposed to an independent Kurdistan. The problem for Mr. Erdogan is that the Kurds are fighting Assad, and so he's finding himself allied with people that he doesn't like, the Kurds, and so he's got some very big problems. And so
as does the entire
as does the entire world. So we'll see.
Exactly.
We still need to wait and see how things shake out.
Yohuru, talk to me a little bit about his crackdown on social media. Why do people or leaders or autocrats such as Erdogan feel so threatened by the citizen journalist?
And they should, from the standpoint that what it is the inability to control the narrative. And ultimately what any political leader aspires to is to shape. We're seeing it now in this country in terms of our political season, how they're perceived and what their agenda is perceived to be. And social media now is this kind of wide open space that allows anyone to really kind of get in there and needle administrations, needle leaders, and that of course is threatening to them. And so that's why I think they're not only in this case, but we see this constantly, this fear of social media and its ability to reach a much wider audience and to really kind of disrupt the kind of state story, the official story.
Is it a threat even to legitimate states?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's interesting because I think it's a larger question. I'd love to hear Dan and Alan weigh in on this. But also the bigger question of if we need a caudillo in that area. Do we need a strong man in Turkey? The idea that the EU's vision of democracy is one thing, but will the political realities of that region demand something different that we may not be entirely comfortable with in terms of our ideas about democracy, but may be necessary in order to maintain stability in the region?
Okay, we don't have time to explore that more fully, but all you have to do is look at Egypt and Iraq, and perhaps you get some questions and some people who say dictatorships aren't necessarily all evil or all bad, and sometimes necessary, would have a different viewpoint on that as well. When we come back, it is time for our lightning round. More on that after this.